Good evening, and welcome to Burlington City Hall, the scene of many exciting adventures. During the last couple of years, we have had a number of prominent and important spokespeople come to Burlington, Vermont. And tonight we're very proud to welcome Noam Chomsky from MIT, who has been a very vocal and important voice in the wilderness of intellectual life in America. At a time when many intellectuals and academicians find it more comfortable to be silent and to go with the flow, as it were, it is comforting to find, on occasion, individuals who have the guts to speak out about the important issues of our time, and certainly Professor Chomsky has been a person to do it. I am particularly delighted to welcome him here to City Hall, because one of the things that we are trying to do in Burlington is to do away with this gap between what happens up there on the Hill and what happens down here, or what presumably happens in Washington regarding Nicaragua and what happens here in local government. We have the belief here that local government is everything that affects human life. And last night, I was very proud that the Board of Aldermen, by an 8-3 vote, approved the resolution supporting opposition to President Reagan's embargo to Nicaragua. And our point of view was that what happens in Nicaragua and what happens in Washington, what is done in the name of the United States of America is done in all of our names, and it is absolutely a local issue. So without saying more, without going any longer, I am delighted to welcome a person who I think we're all very proud of, Professor Noam Chomsky.
The United States is quite unusual among industrial democracies in a number of respects. One of the most obvious, simply has to do with ordinary political participation. So, for example, as measured, say, in voting in presidential elections, the United States is remarkably low among comparable societies in the level of political participation. And a more interesting feature of that is the following. If you look at the non-voters in the United States, they're socioeconomically identifiable pretty well. They are essentially the kind of people who in some European society would vote for one of the labor-based parties, either labor or socialist or communist, all of which are essentially kind of reformist labor-based parties that have a labor constituency and work for them in one fashion or another. By and large, those people don't vote here. Among the unemployed, for example, in the last election, only a third voted. And if you look at the statistics, you find this quite general, and it's been going on for a long time. Well, evidently those people regard themselves as disenfranchised. They don't see any point in voting for what amounts to one of the two branches of the Tory party, there being none that has them as its constituency. There are other respects in which one finds this kind of particularity of the United States. So, for example, just a couple of days ago, there was an article in the Boston Globe, my hometown, where they referred to Howard Zinn, an old friend of mine. There was an article about him and the way he was censored at BU, and it referred to him there as an avowed socialist, kind of with a gasp, you know, as if sort of like an avowed murderer or something. He actually says it and so on. Well, again, in Europe, that would just be comical. You know, you couldn't refer to anybody as an avowed socialist as if that were something surprising. Or in the media in the United States, as far as I know, there isn't a single columnist or reporter, for that matter, who either would identify himself as sort of a mainstream socialist, or if he would be willing to allow it to be known. And again, in Europe, that's just inconceivable. It's unimaginable. All of this reflects a kind of an ideological uniformity and rigidity in the United States, which is striking and is a kind of a counterpart to the absence in the political system of any organization that represents the interests of poor or disadvantaged or working people. One of the best young scholars of American political history, Tom Ferguson, has pointed out in a recent very important study of American political history that political parties in the United States are, I'm quoting now, blocks of major investors who coalesce to advance candidates representing their interests. The real market for political parties is not voters, but rather major investors who generally have good and clear reasons for investing to control the state. And correspondingly, in federal elections, lots of people whose interests are not those of those groups of investors either don't vote, or also, if you look, they also tend to vote contrary to their interests, contrary to their political commitments, as many detailed studies have shown. So, for example, in the last election, of Reagan voters, who were a small minority of the electorate, about 2/3 said that they hoped that his policies weren't enacted. That reflects a kind of rational understanding of the political system. It reflects the understanding that the choices are sort of between Pepsi-Cola and Coca-Cola. You're effectively disenfranchised anyway, so you might as well vote for the guy who makes you feel good. The policies are not going to change all that much. Maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration, but it reflects a certain perception and understanding of political reality. Well, these are some of many indications of what is in fact a rather striking fact about the United States, namely, again, differentiating it from other similar societies. In the United States, there's an extraordinarily high degree of class consciousness on the part of the privileged classes, on the part of business professionals, the elite intellectuals who associate themselves with privilege and power. In those groups, there's a very high, unusually high degree of class consciousness, which manifests itself in lots of ways. And correspondingly, there's an unusually low degree of class consciousness on the part of working people. A good deal about the United States reflects that phenomenon, which does mark this country out to a considerable extent as distinct from other similar societies. Well, one particular manifestation of this phenomenon is the public relations industry, which again is a peculiarly American phenomenon. It exists elsewhere, but nowhere on the scale that it does here. This goes way back in the United States. In the early part of the 20th century, it was beginning to become significant. In 1909, an AT&T executive commented that the public mind is the only serious danger confronting the company. And the PR industry, public relations industry, was in fact created in order to control this threat, to control the public mind and prevent it from being a threat to major corporations. During the First World War, the government got into the act. The government created the first major official propaganda agency. It's called the Creel Commission. Its purpose was to try to drive a generally pacifistic population into the European war. The head of the Creel Commission referred to this as the world's greatest adventure in advertising. And a lesson was learned. The lesson that was learned was that the government can, in fact, control the framework of discussion by flooding the media with so-called facts amounting to official information, and also by defining the issues that are allowed to be discussed. So by those means, and if that can be done effectively, it really doesn't matter what the outcome of debate is. If you can define the issues as you wish, you've essentially won the battle. And that lesson was learned during the war. One of the major members of the Creel Commission was a man named Edward Bernays, who learned the lesson well. He became essentially the patron saint of the modern public relations industry, its leading figure. Years later, he wrote about what he called the engineering of consent, which he described as the essence of democracy, the power to persuade. Now, he didn't go into the question of who has the power to persuade. The answer is pretty obvious. It's the people who own and manage the society. But it's a conception of democracy which is very significant in the United States. The essence of democracy is the power to persuade, which is in the hands of those who essentially own and manage the private economy, and that defines what democracy is. Long before that, in fact, shortly after the First World War, Walter Lippmann, the major American journalist, had recognized the same point, partly because of the experiences of the First World War. He discussed in 1921 what he called the manufacture of consent, which he said is an art that will cause a revolution in the practice of democracy. This idea was taken up with great enthusiasm in the social sciences. One of the leading American political scientists, Harold Lasswell, that's very influential, wrote an article in the Encyclopedia of Social Science in 1933 on propaganda, in which he sort of gave all of this a theoretical basis. He made a distinction between democratic societies and what we nowadays, though he didn't use the term then, would call totalitarian states. And he pointed out that propaganda has a very different function in those two kinds of societies. In a totalitarian state or a military society and so on, propaganda isn't all that important because the state can control behavior by force. But in a democratic society, where the state is restricted in its ability to use force against citizens, at least relatively privileged citizens who have means to defend themselves, in such a society, propaganda becomes much more important, he pointed out. And the reason is that the voice of the people is heard, and therefore it's necessary to ensure that that voice says the right things, that that voice says the things that the leadership regards as correct. In a totalitarian society, that doesn't matter so much, because they're going to do what they want anyway, and if you don't like it, you'll suffer. But the more democratic a society is, the more indoctrination is needed, the more you need manufacture of consent. And Lasswell went on to say that we should not succumb to what he called democratic dogmatisms, such as the idea that people are the best judges of their own interests. That's not true. Despite mass education and so on, people have no idea what their best interests are. The only people who understand their best interests are the privileged elites, and since we have this unfortunate phenomenon of democracy, we have to make sure that privileged elites are not restricted in their ability to carry through the policies that are in fact in the interests of everyone, which means you have to have an effective system of indoctrination. You have to have real manufacture of consent. He went on to, he said that we shouldn't regard propaganda negatively, he said. Propaganda is completely neutral. He said it's as neutral as a pump handle. You can use it for good or for evil, and since, of course, we're good, we're going to use propaganda for good purposes, and therefore we should have a positive attitude towards it. It's, again, the essence of democracy. Well, all of this is familiar in another context. This is all a typical Leninist ideal. The Leninist concept is that the vanguard party, which represents and understands the interests of the working class, should lead because the workers are just too stupid to understand what their own interests are. So therefore the vanguard party, which will take control on the basis of their revolutionary activity, will lead them because it understands, what's right and so on and so forth. And in fact, the relationship between Leninist concepts and the liberal intelligentsia in the West is extremely close. There's the very similar managerial concept of control and indoctrination. And I think this goes part of the way towards explaining why it's a certain phenomenon which has been very common over the years, namely the very sudden and rapid shift from party loyalist to West American jingoist. This happens over and over again. And I think the reason it's so easy is it doesn't really require much of a change in political conception. It really requires a change in estimate as to where the future is, really a kind of a change in choice of masters, more than a change of ideas. Well, what I want to talk about tonight is how all of this, there's a lot to say about this, but I want to drop it, the general talk there, and talk about how this works out in practice. And let me take two current examples, and if there's time, go into some others, because there are many. One example I want to discuss is the recent spate of Vietnam retrospectives that have appeared in all the media in the last couple of weeks, commemorating, or I guess what the right word is, maybe commiserating over the 10th anniversary of the departure of American troops from Vietnam. And the second case I want to discuss is current situation in Central America, which in many ways is strikingly similar, remarkably similar to what was going on in Vietnam in the early 1960s, and that has lessons there. One of the consequences of the disparity in class consciousness, that is, the high level of class consciousness among privileged elites and the very low level of class consciousness among everyone else. One of the consequences of that is that privileged elites are able to learn from history and improve their performance, whereas the rest of us don't, because we don't learn from history and we don't have the resources to even discover what it was, and in fact it's essentially eliminated down the memory hole given the control over resources. And I think it's important to try to overcome that. So I will try to draw some parallels between these two situations, as I'm sure they're being drawn in Washington too. Well, let's begin with the Vietnam retrospectives. But let me begin first by stepping back a bit and trying out a kind of a thought experiment, an imaginary situation. Let's imagine that the Soviet Union, after many years of fighting, leaves Afghanistan, as incidentally they say they will do if what they call neutrality is guaranteed there. So suppose, in fact, they leave Afghanistan, and suppose 10 years after that they have retrospective accounts in the party press. What would we expect to find there, and what would we expect to be omitted? Well, I think that's pretty easy. What we'd expect to find is a focus on the terrorism and violence of the rebels, and there'd be plenty to say about that. And we'd also expect to find a focus on the misery and suffering and repression in the period after the Soviet Union withdrew, and there'd be plenty of that too. When you destroy a society, there's going to be plenty of suffering, and mostly the most brutal elements will survive and take over. So there'd be lots of talk about that, and lots of wailing and shedding tears and so on. There would also be talk about the noble cause of the Soviet Union, which came to the defense of the legitimate government of Afghanistan against terrorist bandits organized by the CIA, and so on and so forth. Some things would also be omitted. One thing that would be sure to be omitted from these retrospective accounts would be the actual war. That is, what actually happened. What were the military operations? What did they do to people, and so on. And another thing that would be omitted, certainly, would be the planning that lay behind the war. With the reasons for it, the things that led the Soviet Union into it. Well, that's the end of the thought experiment. Now let's turn to the real world, and we can be rather brief, because what I've just described is exactly what we've seen in the last month. The American media behaved exactly in the way we would expect a well-disciplined party press to behave in the Soviet Union or any other totalitarian state. A number of things were omitted, in fact, exactly the ones I described, and a number of things were focused on, exactly the ones I described. Let's look a little more carefully. One thing that was omitted virtually totally in the media was the war against South Vietnam. In fact, it isn't even known in the United States that there was an American war against South Vietnam. The only thing that exists in American history is the American defense of South Vietnam. That's our way of referring to the fact that we attacked and practically destroyed South Vietnam. I'll come back to that later. But the actual, not only is the concept missing, but there was no description of it. So if you read Time, Newsweek, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, down the list, you'll find strikingly missing the actual war. No description of the ground operations of the bombing and so on and so forth. The only exception that I saw in a review of all the media on this was 2 pages in Newsweek by Ron Moreau and Tony Clifton, which in fact referred to the fact that there was a war there and described some of its consequences. So that was missing. Another thing that was missing was any discussion of the background planning for the war, the reasons why the United States got into it. There's a ton of documentation on this. This is a very open society, and we have plenty of access to high-level planning documents, and it's very well understood, in fact, if you want to bother understanding what led the United States into the war, but that was missing, down the memory hole, not a mention of it. I didn't even see a word of that. What you found instead was something different. What you read was that the war was a mistake, but a noble mistake, that it was illusory, it was a failed crusade undertaken with the loftiest intentions. Now, these, incidentally, are the phrases used by Stanley Carno in the best-selling companion volume to the PBS television series, which is highly praised or criticized for its critical candor, and which, in fact, is now the subject of a right-wing attack, which will soon be aired, because it was only obedient to this party line and not sufficiently servile to it. So there we read that we started with the loftiest intentions and failed crusade. No evidence is given to testify that. No evidence is offered to suggest that we had lofty intentions or anything else. That's just party line. You don't need evidence for that. Or you read that we entered because of, I'm quoting now, blundering efforts to do good, although this became a disaster by 1969. That's Anthony Lewis. who is, I think, the harshest critic of the war in the American press. Or you read that we entered in an excess of righteousness and disinterested benevolence, and that our defense of South Vietnam was badly conceived. That's John King Fairbank, who's the leading American Asia scholar, and about the harshest critic of the war in American foreign policy you could find in anything close to mainstream academic circles, and on like that. You'll notice that everybody's been quoting as a critic. These are all the critics of American policy. The spectrum of opinion extends from them, from the idea that we entered in an excess of righteousness and disinterested benevolence over to Norman Podhoretz and Ronald Reagan. That's the spectrum. If you've got a magnifying glass, you can actually see that there's something in between. And that's important. It's very important to notice that this is what the critics say. And it's also important to notice that none of this has to be justified. That is, nobody who puts forth these views gives any evidence for it or feels that any evidence is required. That reflects an extraordinarily high degree of success in manufacture of consent and indoctrination. You don't even recognize that there's an alternative, a conceivable alternative to the party line. It's not just that you adopt the party line. It's inconceivable that there could be any alternative to it, so therefore you don't have to give an argument. Well, that's the critics. And all of this illustrates rather well these conceptions of the differences between democracy and totalitarianism that I mentioned before. It's necessary in a democracy to have a level of control over thought so extensive that it is impossible even to imagine that there could be an alternative to the party line. That thought has to be entirely constrained within the spectrum of the critics who I just mentioned and the right. And that's very different from a totalitarian state. In a totalitarian state, typically you have a kind of a ministry of truth, which produces the truth, and everybody can identify it, you know where it's coming from the government, and you have to obey. The extent to which there's often a cost for disobedience. How costly it is depends on the violence of the state. So, for example, in the Soviet Union, if you disobey, you might be ignored, but if not, you could be sent for psychiatric torture or prison or exile under grim conditions or something like that. In a typical American dependency like El Salvador, what will happen is you'll end up in a ditch with your head cut off after hideous torture. And states vary, on the level of violence that they use. That's us, that's them. But it's always dangerous. In a democracy, typically that doesn't happen. You don't have a ministry of truth which presents the party line, which you can then... This totalitarian system, in a certain sense, leaves you free, internally free. You don't really have to believe it. You can identify it. You can't... There's a danger in departing from it openly, but you can essentially believe whatever you want. In a democratic system, that's not true. You can't believe whatever you want. It's dangerous if you believe whatever you want, because they can't do to you what they do to you in El Salvador. Therefore, you better only think the right thoughts, and therefore all thought has to be constrained. So we get the result that I just described. And that was typical throughout the war. There was, it's kind of intriguing to see how it worked. There was, of course, a debate over the war in the 60s in mainstream circles. That debate was between people called hawks and people called doves. The hawks were people like, for example, journalist Joseph Alsop, who held that if the United States used sufficient degree of violence, it could win the war. And the doves were people like Arthur Schlesinger, who was described as an anti-war leader and kind of a leading dove. And his view was that no matter, even if we used extensive violence, we probably wouldn't win. Although, he went on to say, I'm quoting now, that we all pray that Mr. Alsop will be right. And if the American government does succeed, he said, we will all be praising the wisdom and statesmanship of the American government in reducing Vietnam to what he called a land of ruin and wreck. Now, that's the dove position. If you read, and that's not very far in the past, read today's editorials about El Salvador, and that's exactly what the liberal press is saying. They're saying, well, it looks like we can reduce the land to ruin and wreck and massacre enough people so that we'll win, so therefore we should all be praising the wisdom and statesmanship of the government. That's the critics' position, as it's been in the past. Now, between those two positions, the doves and the hawks, you're allowed to have a debate. In fact, the more vigorous the debate, the better the propaganda system likes it. Because the more vigorous the debate, the more deeply you instill the unstated principles, which are, of course, that the United States has the right to use force and violence to achieve its ends, and the only question that can be raised about this is whether it will succeed at a low enough cost. Now, again, in a totalitarian system, you could never put forth that principle. It would be too crude. But in a democratic system, again, you don't say it openly, but it's presupposed by the debate, and the idea is that that's supposed to, and it often does, instill the principle. So the ordinary person on the outside will say, well, you know, if even the critics assume this, who am I to question it? In fact, it's the critics who play the major role in a democratic system of thought control in ensuring that the manufacture of consent works. That's incidentally why they're tolerated, in fact honored. They play a major role. My own view is that if dictators were smarter, they would use our system. I think they don't understand the benefits of a lively, exciting debate between positions which assume the same principles and appear to be at opposite ends because they differ tactically with regard to how well those principles can be enacted. That's a very effective technique of thought control, one that's been honed to a high art in the United States as part of our general PR system. Well, let me say that here we have to enter some qualifications. While this propaganda system worked like a dream among the educated classes, it didn't work all that well among the population at large. And that shows up. It shows up in polls, for example. As recently as 1982, which is the latest one I saw, the Gallup poll asked the question, and they have a poll, you know, the United States is a heavily polled country, not for our information, but because business likes to monitor public attitudes for all sorts of reasons. Sometimes we also hear about it. They have polls on international affairs, in 1982, they asked the question, do you think that the Vietnam War was a mistake, or was it, I'm quoting now, fundamentally wrong and immoral? Well, of the general population, 72% said it was fundamentally wrong and immoral. Many fewer so-called opinion leaders held that position. That includes clergy and so on. And among articulate intellectuals, virtually nobody ever held that position. Even at the height of opposition to the war, the number of people who felt that it was something other than a mistake, that aggression is wrong, in other words, was minuscule among the educated classes. There's a big split, in other words, between the attitude of the general population on this issue and the attitude of the educated classes. That split even has a name. It's called the Vietnam Syndrome. The terminology is interesting. Syndrome is a term you use for a disease, right? And the Vietnam Syndrome is a kind of a disease that spread over the population, namely the discipline began to break down, not among the educated. They held the line. But among the general population, discipline began to break down, and this disease spread with really terrifying symptoms, such as a refusal to follow orders, or raising questions about what the state is doing, or even worse, something like, say, sympathy for victims of American violence and feelings of solidarity with them and so on. That's a disease that has to be overcome. It's not a disease that was ever widespread or even particularly noticeable among privileged or educated groups, but it did spread among the population. And this distinction, incidentally, is not unique to this case. In many cases, you find that the educated parts of the population are the most extensively indoctrinated, the ones who understand least about the world, and the ones who believe most fervently the principles of the faith. And that's not surprising either, if you think about it. Educated people are subjected to much more intensive indoctrination. Well, that's what education is. And, you know, they're the ones who suffer from it. They're its victims. But also they have a kind of a class interest in believing it, because their social role is to be the purveyors of propaganda. So therefore it's necessary to kind of internalize it and believe it. And if you don't do that, you sort of are marginalized and eliminated from the intellectual class. So it's not too surprising that among the educated you find the least understanding and the most profound indoctrination. The inability, for example, even to conceive that there could be an alternative to the party line on issues such as those I discussed. Well, let me turn now to the things that are omitted in this discussion. There are two major things that were omitted in the retrospectives. The first is the background planning. And here let me generalize it, because in fact there is underlying the American war in Vietnam, though you wouldn't know it from the media or from most books. There was a very well worked out geopolitical conception, which didn't only apply to Vietnam, but applies worldwide. My own feeling is if you understand this geopolitical conception, a lot of what happens in the world will fall into place now and in the future. And if you don't understand it, most of what's going on in the world is going to look like a total mystery and just kind of wandering around randomly from blunder to blunder or something like that. You can even get a pretty good reputation as a prophet if you get to understand what the underlying thinking is. And it's, again, well documented, though you got to search to find the documents. They're not, they're suppressed in effect. The main, it goes way back, but I want to start from the Second World War, which represented a qualitative change. The United States emerged from the Second World War in a position of global power that had very few counterpart, probably no counterpart in history. I doubt if there'd ever been a time in history when any single power had such a degree of world domination in terms of control over wealth, in terms of military power, and so on. And going back to what I said before, American elites are very class-conscious, very self-conscious. They understood this, they planned, and they prepared, they worked out how the post-war world should be, how it should be run and organized, so as to conform to their interests in a world that they expected to rule and dominate to an extent without historical precedent. From 1939 to 1945, there were a long series of meetings run by the Council on Foreign Relations, which is the major business input into policy planning, and the State Department. It included all top planners in the State Department. This is called the War Peace Studies Group. And they were essentially planning the post-war world. By 1943 or so, it was pretty obvious how it was going to come out. They developed a concept which they called the Grand Area. The Grand Area was to be a region subordinated to the needs of the American economy. As one planner put it, it was a region strategically necessary for world control. And the Grand Area was to include as a minimum the entire Western Hemisphere, the Far East, and the former British Empire, which we were in the process of taking over during the war. That's incidentally something called anti-imperialism in American history writing. And it was also to include Western Europe and the oil-producing regions of the Middle East, and in fact everything if possible, but at least that much. That was the Grand Area, which was to be subordinated to the needs of the American economy, and rather detailed plans were laid for particular regions in the Grand Area. I'll come back to some of them. The thinking behind all of this was explained very lucidly by one of the most important American political thinkers and planners of the period, namely George Kennan. He's interesting, for one thing, because he's smart, and he says things clearly and accurately. And he's also interesting for the same reason that the critics I quoted before are interesting. He's at the end of the spectrum. He's at the humane, liberal, dovish end of the spectrum. And he's also very lucid, so his conception, sort of a fortiori, everything holds for everyone else, worse, in other words. So here's what you hear at the liberal end of the spectrum in this period. This is George Kennan in February 1948, happens to be the top secret document that I'm quoting from. Paraphrasing, I'm not actually quoting. He says there that, he starts by pointing out that the United States has 50% of the world's wealth, but only 6.3% of the world's population. This disparity, he says, causes envy and resentment. The major goal of our foreign policy must be to maintain the disparity. Now, to maintain the disparity, it's going to require harsh measures. We therefore should put aside what he called vague and idealistic slogans, such as, I'm quoting now, human rights, raising of the living standards, and democratization, and be prepared to use harsh measures. The less we're hampered by idealistic slogans, the better. We should put aside all ideas about world benefaction and altruism and be ready to use force if necessary. That's the message. That's the way you maintain the disparity. Well, that was the planning from the liberal side. Let me make a comment on that first. When he talks about the disparity between the United States and the rest of the world, there's something hidden, of course. The United States doesn't mean the people of the United States. There's actually a comparable disparity internal to the United States. And that must be maintained too, although we didn't bother to say that because this is foreign policy. But internal to the United States, there's also a disparity which has to be maintained, and for that you also need harsh measures. And in fact, the planners recognized throughout that if the United States moved towards a more egalitarian society, something which is obviously not contemplated or conceivable, then it would not be necessary to have a global order subordinated to the needs of the American economy. There were other kinds of arrangements that would be possible without such primacy given to what we ought to call the freedom to rob if you didn't have to maintain the internal disparity. But of course that was not in question. That's also discussed extensively. Well, that was Kennan as a that document actually happened to refer to the Far East, but the United States is a global power, and the same ideas were developed for other regions. Continuing with Kennan, in the case of Latin America, the other area I want to talk about, Kennan explained in a briefing to Latin American ambassadors that he explained that a prime goal of our foreign policy must be what he called the protection of our raw materials. Notice no mincing of words here. Protection of our raw materials. And protection of our raw materials means protection against the indigenous population, because they're the only ones who are going to take them. We've already kicked out the British, and the Russians are only there to frighten the domestic population. But the real enemy is the indigenous population. And we got to protect our raw materials from them. And to do so, he said, again, harsh measures will be necessary. We should not refrain from police measures if necessary, he said. It's better to have a harsh government in power than a government that's liberal and relaxed and tolerant of what he called communists. Well, here the term communists has a very special meaning in American political theology. It refers to people, whatever their political commitments, who are committed to stealing our resources, that is, to using them for domestic needs. They're communists by definition, and it doesn't matter what they believe. They can believe New Deal capitalists or whatever, but they're communists. And those are the people against whom we have to use harsh measures, including police measures, which makes some sense if we have to protect their resources and maintain the disparity as the prime element in our foreign policy. That's Latin America. Incidentally, what Kennan may very well have had in mind was a State Department intelligence report that had come out just a year earlier, which warned of a rather dangerous doctrine that it was spreading over much of the world, including Latin America, namely the belief that, I'm quoting now, that governments have a responsibility for the welfare of their people. Now, that's communism in our terms, and obviously that has to be stopped, because if governments arise that have a responsibility for the welfare of their people, they don't have a corresponding responsibility for our welfare, and that's obviously the transcendent need if you have to protect our raw materials and maintain the disparity. Well, that's Latin America. With regard to Asia, the geopolitical picture that was developed was that sooner or later Japan was going to be reconstituted as the industrial heartland of Asia. Japan is a resource-poor area and also needs markets. Therefore, in order to ensure that Japan, this industrial society, remains essentially within American control, it would be necessary to provide Japan with resources and raw materials, which meant primarily South and Southeast Asia. So in this global, remember, these are global planners. They're not playing for small stakes. In the global planning that was developed, the United States was going to have to ensure that a reindustrialized Japan, operating within the framework of American power, would have access to resources and raw materials, in particular in Southeast Asia. That's, in fact, directly the thinking that led us behind into the Vietnam War. Now let me turn to what was, that's the omitted geopolitical conception. That's never discussed. None of this is ever discussed in the planning document, in the retrospectives, or in fact almost anywhere in American history, except unless you go to sort of technical monographs that you are sure that only a small number of people are going to read or something. Let me say that I've just barely touched the surface. This goes on to quite detailed and explicit planning, pursuing these basic ideas in about the way you'd expect. Well, now let's turn to the omitted history, the history that was down the memory hole in these retrospectives. Remember what happened. Let's remind ourselves of that. Starting around 1948, the United States recognized explicitly, all of this incidentally is in secret documents. In public, of course, you don't talk about things like this. Like no president gets up to the public and says, look, folks, we have to rob the rest of the world in order to maintain the disparity between us and them, meaning between the rich here and them, meanwhile keeping you guys down where you belong too. And we're going to have to use force to do that. Presidents don't say that. What they talk about is our noble objectives and our lofty intentions and so on, and the well-disciplined intellectuals repeat that stuff for them. That's what the media are about and what the schools and universities are about and so on. But this is now the real world. Well, now let's look at the history in the real world, also secret. I mean, the events are not, but the documents are. By 1948, the State Department had recognized explicitly that the nationalist movement of Indochina was led by Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh, the anti-French resistance. And they recognize that there is really no alternative. There's no expedient short of alternative that could be concocted. However, they also recognize that that's unacceptable. The reason it's unacceptable is that a nationalist movement in Vietnam under the leadership of the Viet Minh might very well be successful in social and economic development. And if it were successful, then that invokes a certain theory, which we call sometimes the domino theory, but actually, to be historically accurate, we really ought to call it the rotten apple theory, because that's the image that's constantly used. The idea is that one rotten apple in the barrel may infect the whole barrel. That is, if one country undertakes successful social and economic development independent of the United States, other countries might try to do the same thing. People next across the border are going to say, why not us? You know? And then the rot may spread, as the planners put it. If you think I'm kidding you to read the documents, the rot of social and economic development that would be successful, as Kissinger put it, and with regard to Allende, the contagion may spread and infect other regions. These disease metaphors are very commonly used, and you can see why, and it's really frightening that people are stealing our resources all over the place. So according to the rotten apple theory, which then became, the domino theory, if there is successful social and economic development, although Vietnam isn't all that important, the right to rob Vietnam was not all that important, though Eisenhower made all sorts of speeches about tin and tungsten and so on. But mainly it wasn't that. The problem was that the rot might spread, and therefore the sort of cancerous growth had to be stopped at its source. So we therefore supported the French in their effort to reconquer their former colony, and by the end of that war, which was 1954, when the French pulled out, we were providing about 80% of the costs. That was a very serious war. About 500,000 people, 500,000 Vietnamese died during that period. Well, that was 1954. The French pulled out. We came rather close to using nuclear weapons at that time. The United States was really intent on preventing the rot from spreading. The French pulled out. There was a political settlement. The United States moved in, blocked the political settlement, installed in South Vietnam the kind of government that we're very familiar with in our history. We installed a typical Latin American terror and torture state, the kind we have a lot of practice with, and it immediately blocked the political settlement, but it also turned to the task of massacring the domestic population. Again, that's what we know about from our own history. The government that we installed killed off about 70,000 or 80,000 people by about 1960, which is, again, not a small number. This had the effect that it often has, namely it aroused resistance, kind of an odd phenomenon that nobody understands. And that, of course, proved that the Russians are coming, as it also always does. By 1960, when Kennedy came in, there was a problem. The government that we had established, which everybody in Washington knew had no popular base, was collapsing because now there was resistance after this massacre. And what were we going to do? So what Kennedy did, and this is instructive, what Kennedy did was simply to attack South Vietnam. In 1961 and 62, the American Air Force was sent to bomb South Vietnam. No subterfuges. American planes from the American Air Force started extensive bombing and defoliation in South Vietnam. This was part of a broad program intended to drive several million people, maybe up to 7 million people or so, into concentration camps, which we call strategic hamlets, where they would be surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards, and, as we put it, protected from the guerrillas who, as we conceded, they were willingly supporting. Well, that was that program. When any other country does that, we call it aggression. That's like what the Russians are doing in Afghanistan. But when we do it, it's defense. In fact, the extent of the servility of the liberal intelligentsia on this is kind of remarkable. For example, Arthur Schlesinger, again, the anti-war leader, and let me keep to the critics because they're by far the more interesting. Schlesinger has a book about this period, a book called 1,000 Days, The History of the Kennedy Administration. And he talks about the year 1962 when this attack began. He says 1962 was not a bad year. He says aggression was checked in Vietnam, meaning the aggression of the Vietnamese against us was checked by our attack against South Vietnam. That's what happened in 1962. But as that gets filtered into party history, its aggression is checked in South Vietnam. This was explained rather nicely by another hero of the liberal pantheon, Adlai Stevenson, at the United Nations. He said that in Vietnam we were engaged in defense against what he called internal aggression. It's a lovely Orwellian concept. Orwell wasn't smart enough to dream it up. We're defending ourselves against the internal aggression of the Vietnamese in Vietnam. as we do in many parts of the world. Well, that was the early 60s. Meanwhile, the Kennedy and the Johnson administration continued the war, extended the war against South Vietnam. They overthrew government after government because they couldn't find anyone who was sufficiently enthusiastic to support our escalation of the war against the South. They blocked every political settlement. They blocked neutralization. They also understood exactly what they were doing. Nothing about lofty intentions or, benevolence or anything like this. They understood exactly what they were doing. It's explained very well by government scholars. For example, Douglas Pike, who was the leading government scholar on the Viet Cong, and who wrote at the time about this period that it was obviously impossible to accept a political settlement because he said we could not expect our minnow to compete politically with their whale. Well, obviously you can't have a political settlement if they have a whale and we have a minnow. Can't have democracy under those circumstances. So we couldn't nourish the whale. It was minnow. So what we had to do was destroy the whale. So therefore we had to attack South Vietnam. No lofty intentions, nothing else. This is just ordinary consequences of the Kennan-esque geopolitical thoughts that I described. Well, that takes us to about 1965. By 1965, the United States had killed off about 160,000 people or more in South Vietnam. Those are not small numbers. Give some comparisons later if you like. But they compare with Pol Pot, for instance, the real facts. That's before we got into the war, officially. About 160,000 killed. In 1965, the government was again collapsing. We had to carry out an extensive land invasion of South Vietnam. We also started the systematic bombardment. We had then been bombing South Vietnam for about 3 years, but that's when the systematic bombardment began, like B-52 bombings in the Mekong Delta and so on. We also attacked the north at that time. The period from 65 to 75, I won't go into anymore, the United States extended the war also to Laos and Cambodia. The total casualties during that period are probably in the neighborhood of about 3 million in Vietnam and maybe 750,000 or so or maybe close to 1 million in Laos and Cambodia. Well, you add it all up, it comes to about 5 million casualties, which is a lot. The land was ravaged. The societies were destroyed, particularly in South Vietnam, where the popular movements were wiped out. There are millions and millions of refugees. By 1970, I should say, it was pretty obvious that the end result was going to be either just, total annihilation of the place, or else a North Vietnamese takeover. That's what I myself wrote in 1970, that it would end up with a North Vietnamese takeover for the very simple reason that every other indigenous society was destroyed. So there'd be nothing left except the North Vietnamese. That's pretty much what happened 5 years later, and that consequence of American savagery is now used as a retrospective justification for it. Say, look, the North Vietnamese have taken over. We were right to destroy South Vietnam. That's, again, a propaganda operation that Goebbels would have admired, but it's intriguing to notice that it goes on in the media with no comment. Nobody can comment on it. Well, again, that tells us something. The end result of all of this is that the United States won a partial victory. This is called a defeat in Vietnam, but that's because they misunderstood. One thing that all the media retrospectives agreed on was that the United States was defeated. They say that's indubitable. Well, it happens to be untrue. In fact, virtually anything that's stated as undubitable in the propaganda system is probably false. That's a good rule of thumb. And this is one such thing. The United States wasn't defeated and couldn't be defeated. A country this powerful can't be defeated. It can only be partially defeated. And we won the major objective, namely the rotten apple theory isn't going to work. The chances that Vietnam will be a model of social and economic development for anybody else are very low. They'll be lucky to survive after this assault. And that's a very significant victory when you think about what the real reasons were, not the lofty intentions and so on, which are, to pacify the population, but the real thinking, that's a victory. And we've been ensuring it ever since. The post-war American policy is designed to guarantee that there'll be a maximum of oppression and suffering and also brutality in Indochina. So we've refused reparations, which we certainly owe them. We've refused aid. We've blocked trade. We've blocked aid from international organizations. We've tried to prevent other countries from aiding them. For example, the level of sadism that was achieved in this is kind of hard to imagine sometimes. One of the things that the United States did in the war against Vietnam was to destroy most of the buffalo. Well, that's a peasant society. Buffalo means tractors, fertilizers, and so on. In fact, like the Washington Post publishes pictures of peasants pulling plows, and this is supposed to be proof of communist iniquity. Actually, those pictures were in fact fabrications of Thai intelligence, very likely, but they could have gotten real pictures if they wanted. And the reason why peasants are pulling plows, it's because we killed the buffalo. Well, India tried to send 100 buffalo, which is nothing, you know, and the United States tried to block it by blocking food for peace aid, believe it or not. Mennonites tried to send pencils to Cambodia. The government tried to block it. Oxfam tried to send solar pumps to Cambodia. They tried to block it. You know, shovels to Laos to dig up unexploded ordnance. Nothing is allowed. You know, that country has to suffer maximally so that we can then use that suffering to justify the attack and to justify similar attacks against other countries. That's the post-war policy. President Carter, in one of his sermons about human rights, literally said the following. He said that we owe Vietnam no debt. He said because the destruction was mutual. You know, that's a statement that bears comparison to Stalin or Hitler, actually. But it passed without a mention. There wasn't a comment on it in the American press. Yep, the destruction was mutual. Just sort of walk around the streets of Washington and Boston, and you can see it's just like it's like Vin and so on. But the fact again that this statement could be made, this monstrous statement could be made without comment, again that tells you something about the manufacture of consent, the level of indoctrination. Well, in fact, all of this was a triumph of the manufacture of consent, again among the educated part of the population, less so elsewhere where the Vietnam syndrome remains. Well, let me briefly turn to Central America and draw a few parallels. I won't go through the whole history because it's too long and horrifying. The United States has in fact been tormenting Central America for over 130 years now, actually back to 1800 if you pursue it in all of its gory detail. In 1854, the first major military attack took place. This was against Nicaragua. In 1854, the American Navy burned down a town, port town, San Juan del Norte, in Nicaragua. This was not a capricious act, I should say. It was an act of revenge. What had happened is that an American millionaire, Cornelius Vanderbilt, had sailed his yacht into the town, and the port officials had tried to levy charges against it. So in retaliation, the Navy burned the town down. That town was captured about a year ago briefly for a couple of days by Contras, and the press made a big fuss about it, but they kind of omitted the history, which is interesting. That was 1854. Through this century, the United States, for long periods, invaded and occupied Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, Panama, Honduras, country after country. Virtually every country that we invaded and occupied, we left after, ravaging it and so on. In Haiti, reinstating slavery and torturing and so on. We left murderous military dictators who remained, Trujillo, Somoza, the Duvaliers, and so on. That's the characteristic result. Without going into details, the whole region has been turned into a kind of a horror chamber, one of the worst in the world, with slavery, mass starvation, while croplands are turned to exports, torture, murder, any horror you can think of. That's an interesting reflection of American history. If this, in a really free society, this kind of stuff would be taught in elementary school, but here it's suppressed, and the extent to which it's suppressed is again remarkable. You can take a look this morning at the New York Times, where there's an op-ed by the editor of Foreign Policy, the more liberal of the general foreign policy journals, in which he describes how awful Central America is, and he gives all the reasons, the Spanish, colonization, the culture, and so on and so forth. One reason happens to be missing, guess which one. That's a level of cowardice and dishonesty which again is very hard to duplicate elsewhere, but is absolutely characteristic here. Well, that's Central America in general. Let's take a look at El Salvador in particular. In El Salvador in 1932, there was a mass murder. Maybe 20 or 30,000 peasants were killed, and the country was traumatized and disciplined. The dictator who carried it out ran an election for the benefit of the United States in which he was the only candidate, and we duly recognized him. Everything was fine, just normal torture and starvation and so on, until about 1960, when there was a reformist officers' coup, which looked like it might change the situation. The Kennedy administration blocked it, supported a counter-coup, restored a military dictatorship. Again, things were quiet through the 60s. In 1972, there was an election. The people who were elected were Duarte and Guillermo Ungo, who's now head of the political organization associated with the guerrillas. However, the election was immediately overthrown by a military coup. backed by the United States involving the participation of the two of the most loyal and murderous U.S. allies, Guatemala and Nicaragua. Duarte came to Washington at that time. Nobody was interested. The only senators, congressmen who would even talk to him were Kennedy and Tom Harkin. The rest didn't care, the press didn't care, and so on. That expresses our interest in elections. The same thing happened in 1977. Again, no interest. In fact, everything was fine. It was under a military dictator, just the normal story. However, there were two developments that were worrisome. The first was what was happening in Nicaragua. In 1979, Somoza, who was the most loyal American ally, was overthrown, and the Carter administration was beginning to be concerned that the same thing might happen in El Salvador, and the United States might also lose control there. The second thing that was happening was even more threatening. There was a growth through the 1970s of what they called their popular organizations. Now, these typically started from things like, say, Bible study groups run by the church, which turned into self-help organizations, which sometimes became peasant cooperatives or peasant associations and unions and so on and so forth. In fact, there was the beginning of the development of popular organizations in which people could actually participate. And that's intolerable for a very simple reason. That's the basis for democracy. You can't have democracy in any meaningful sense if isolated individuals have to face concentrated power alone. If that's the system you've got, then democracy amounts to pushing a lever once every couple of years to choose between representatives of one or another group that has a base in the private, elsewhere usually the private economy. Real democracy means participation. It means isolated individuals with limited resources can pool those resources, can have ideas, can exchange information, can have access to information, can put forth programs, and can figure out ways to implement those programs in the political agenda. Unless you've got that, you don't have any democracy. Now, there's one group, of course, that has that. Well, whatever groups there are that own the private economy typically have that ability, but nobody else does. And that's a prerequisite to democracy, and that was beginning to develop in El Salvador in the 70s, which is very frightening, as you can see from the geopolitical considerations that I mentioned. Well, what did the United States do? In 1979, the Carter administration, in October 79, backed a reformist coup, a military coup, which overthrew the dictatorship. The Carter administration, who they were afraid it was going to fall, the Carter administration, however, insisted that the most reactionary and brutal military elements be dominant in the junta. Killings rapidly increased. By early 1980, a few months later, the group had collapsed. The left Christian Democrats, the socialists, the reformist military officers were out, and power was back in the hands of the usual thugs who we support in Latin America. At that point, Jose Napoleon Duarte came in to provide a cover for what he knew was going to happen next, namely a huge massacre, to try to crush the popular organizations, and he's been playing that role ever since, much to the applause of the American audience, which regards this as a great proof of that he should win the Nobel Peace Prize or something like that. That was early 1980. In February, right at that time, the Archbishop Romero, wrote a letter to Carter, an important letter, in which he pleaded with Carter not to send military aid. The reason, he said, was that military aid would be used to increase the repression and to destroy the popular organizations, which he said are fighting for the fundamental human rights. But of course that was the very essence of American policy, so Carter naturally sent the aid. He sent it, again, with an astonishing Orwellian phrase. Namely, he said, he went to Congress, he said, we have to send the military aid so that the military can play a more significant role in reforms. He knew exactly what the reforms were going to be. They were exactly what the Archbishop said, namely destruction of the, increasing the repression and destruction of the popular organizations. Well, that's what happened, exactly as predictable and predicted. A couple of weeks later, the Archbishop was assassinated. In May 1980, Carter's war against the peasantry began with major massacres, usually in areas designated for land reform, which provided a kind of cover for the massacres. In June, the university was attacked and destroyed. Many people killed, the buildings pillaged and destroyed. In November, the political opposition was massacred. Meanwhile, the independent press was wiped out. We don't believe in censorship in the United States. What we believe in is what we did in El Salvador. Namely, you blow up the newspaper, you take the editor out, and you hack him to pieces with the machete, and so on and so forth, and pretty soon there's no need for censorship. So there isn't any censorship in El Salvador. That was the Carter War, about 10,000 people killed during that one, mostly suppressed in the press here, I should say. Duarte himself said that the masses were with the guerrillas at that time, but he felt better afterwards. He said, now they're not anymore, which is probably true after you're subjected to an experience like that. Carter's war against the popular organizations was a success. They were destroyed. But again, it had the usual consequence. People began to flock to the guerrillas, which proves that the Russians were coming. That period is very similar to what happened in Vietnam in the late 1950s. Very similar. Check it out. You find very much the same was happening. Well, at that point, Reagan came in. What he would have expected to do is exactly what Kennedy did, namely escalate the war by American bombing. He didn't. He tried, but he didn't. The reason he didn't was because this country has changed a lot in the past 20 years. When Kennedy attacked South Vietnam, there was virtually no protest. In fact, as I mentioned, that event doesn't exist in American history, which is an indication of the depth of indoctrination of the period. But that's not true anymore. When Reagan began to move towards direct aggression against El Salvador, there was a very substantial popular response, and the government had to back off. They've had to use more devious methods to carry out mass slaughter in El Salvador, which have been very brutal and destructive, but it's still short of B-52 bombing and so on and so forth. Well, Reagan picked it up where Carter left off. By the end of 1981, according to church sources in El Salvador, about 30,000 people had been killed and about 600,000 refugees have been created. And as the church announced that, Jeane Kirkpatrick made a speech in which he extolled the moral quality of the government that was doing it. Those figures have incidentally been approximately doubled since. Well, that's El Salvador. It's still going on. There's no commentary on it. There's no debate over it. It's considered among reasonable people, among reasonable, humane people, it's considered simply our right to carry out mass murder in El Salvador. So there's nothing to debate. Nothing in Congress about it, nothing in the press, very little reported. If you want to learn about it, you've got to go to the reports of human rights organizations, which document in detail the indiscriminate murder carried out by the Air Force with with American control and coordination, the torture in the prisons and so on and so forth. But in the press, nothing. It's just a marvelous tribute to our success that all of this is happening. There is some protest about Nicaragua, and that again tells you something about the nature of the propaganda system and the way the government sets the terms of debate. Incidentally, here the peace movement has fallen into the trap totally. Let me illustrate. It's very similar to what happened in the mid-'60s. In the mid-'60s, there was considerable protest about the war against North Vietnam, the bombing of North Vietnam, but very little protest about the bombing of South Vietnam, which was far more intense and far more destructive, and the ground war against South Vietnam even more so. The protest was against the war against the North. And the reason was that carried potential costs for us. The war against the South has no costs. We just murdered defenseless people. It doesn't cost a thing. In fact, that's kind of a historical vocation, you might say. The war against the North, however, is problematic. It could bring in the Chinese, it could bring in the Russians. It has international complications. It's another country, So therefore, there was protest about it. The Pentagon incidentally noticed this. McNamara, for example, points out in secret documents that the protest is against the bombing of the North, not against the more intensive bombing of the South, and drew the appropriate conclusions. Notice how the story is being replayed today. The attack against Nicaragua is bad enough. In fact, it's very bad. But it's nothing like the attack against El Salvador. I mean, not remotely like it. But the protest is against the attack on Nicaragua. The government has framed the debate so that you're allowed to discuss whether the United States should or should not attack Nicaragua, but you're not allowed to discuss whether we have the right to attack El Salvador. That's just a given. That's out of discussion. The peace movement has fallen into the trap totally. The Pledge of Resistance, for example, is a pledge of resistance if the government escalates the war against Nicaragua. There is no pledge of resistance if the government continues the war against El Salvador. Again, that's a given. Lots of people were arrested, me included, last week about the embargo against Nicaragua, but nobody was arrested and there was no demonstration about the mass slaughter being conducted in El Salvador. That's a given again. Again, this illustrates the enormous power of the state to set the terms of discussion, to frame the discussion in terms acceptable to it. The debate over Nicaragua is more or less acceptable, because that could, just as the debate over North Vietnam was acceptable, because kind of lying behind that is the idea that somehow it can be construed in defensive terms. It can be construed as defense of El Salvador against somebody, and then you can argue about whether there's really an attack or not. But the attack against South Vietnam or the attack against El Salvador, that can't be construed in any terms other than mass slaughter. And in fact, if you look at its reasons, they're obvious, to prevent exactly the reasons that the Archbishop gave, namely to destroy the popular organizations that are fighting for the people's fundamental human rights. There's no way to make that tolerable to the propaganda system, so therefore you've got to suppress it. And we all play along, I should say myself included, the peace movement included. We all play along because we're so effectively brainwashed. Well, all of that illustrates once again the triumphs of the manufacture of consent in a society with a sophisticated and class-conscious ruling class that learns, that thinks, that has resources, that plans, and that in fact controls the means of indoctrination, as long as the educated classes accept the appropriate degree of servility. The same story could be repeated with regard to the Middle East, with regard to the so-called arms race and all sorts of other things, and also domestic issues. No time for that. Well, when a superpower gains the ability to, when it develops an effective system of indoctrination, then the world becomes a very dangerous place. We here should be able to come to understand these crucial features of our society and also to act to change them. The fate of many millions of people throughout the world, and very likely the fate of human civilization, depends quite directly, I think, on our willingness to undertake that task and to carry it forth with honesty and courage and determination.
What I said was I thank Professor Chomsky for mentioning the fact that the peace movement has not picked up very much on the slaughter of citizens in El Salvador. However, part of the peace movement has. That part is an organization known as CISPAS, which is a solidarity organization for El Salvador. And CISPAS has, in fact, been running a campaign since early this spring opposing the bombing in El Salvador. One of the problems is, of course, that it's a small organization in the United States, and the Congress hasn't followed along. But I will say that I have brochures outside at the Casa table where you can send money and you can do whatever is possible, and I'm sure Noam can tell you some of the things that we as American citizens can do. But I have brochures describing the bombing campaign in El Salvador and suggesting means for overcoming the bombing campaign in El Salvador. And if everybody would come to the next CASA meeting, which is the first Wednesday in the month of June, right here, 7 o'clock at the downstairs conference room. We meet every first Wednesday and third Monday of the month at 7 o'clock. We'll give you things to do. And I think, as Noam has pointed out, that's our only hope in this struggle.
I'd certainly endorse that. This is really a scandal, the way we've let that go by. Let me just make one comment about that. Duarte, who's the official hero around here, recently announced that he's not going to accept any more human rights charges from the Church Human Rights Office, Tutela Legal, because he said it's allied with people who are controlled by the subversives. That is, the church is all communists. That's the guy who's the big Democrat. And he also said at that time that the Air Force is not engaged in any indiscriminate attacks against civilians. It's only engaged in air attacks supporting ground forces. The contrary of that is described in very graphic and gory detail in a series of America's Watch reports in the last couple of months, this one last month, one last August, and one last April. That's the man who everyone is lauding, as the next Nobel Peace Prize laureate.
Yeah.
How do you know what's in the secret documents if they're secret?
Oh, because, again, this is a very open society, more so than any other in the world, and secret documents do get released. So the documents that I was quoting, in fact, have all been released. They were top secret documents, I'm sorry. There's also a very valuable store of documents which were released, liberated, we might say, thanks to Dan Ellsberg, namely the Pentagon Papers. And that's particularly valuable because usually you don't get access to a government's secret documents unless the government decides to release them. That was a case where the government didn't decide to release them, and in fact, they're very interesting. However, I should say that they're not all that different from the public documents that have been released. We have access. This, I don't know what would happen if scholars and journalists ever started using the documentary record. Maybe at that point they'd stop releasing it. But the fact of the matter is they do release it. It sort of doesn't matter too much because nobody ever sees it except some, fanatics. But it's there if you want to look. And in fact, there are books and articles discussing it too.
In terms of the Pentagon Papers, how did it happen that the New York Times, given the civility of the press, made a decision?
Well, you have to remember when it was. That was 1972. And there's some important things to bear in mind here. In January 1968, the Tet Offensive took place. Now, the Tet Offensive changed the calculation of costs of American elites. They decided, there was a question how to react to the Tet Offensive. Tet Offensive was an astonishing event. I mean, throughout South Vietnam, in just about every city, there was a coordinated, even the term is very misleading. I mean, the term, again, reflects the indoctrination system. It's a logical impossibility for the South Vietnamese to carry out an offensive in South Vietnam. It wasn't an offensive. It was an uprising against the aggressors. That's what we ought to call it. But the Tet uprising took place in a coordinated fashion in just about every city in South Vietnam. The Americans had over 500,000 troops there. There were very few North Vietnamese. There were, in fact, only about 50,000 North Vietnamese, mostly at the border. They were probably outnumbered at the time by the Thai and Korean mercenaries that we had there, and the United States just dwarfed anyone. Nobody had an inkling of it. There's this coordinated mass uprising in city after city, which the United States, which just was controlling the whole society, had no inkling of. That's an indication of the extent of the popular involvement in it. They now like to say that the result was a victory for the United States, and in a certain sense that's true. The United States had such enormous firepower that it was able to wipe out huge numbers of South Vietnamese. So in that sense, of course, it was a victory. But it frightened people in Washington. It made them recognize that it was going to be a long, drawn-out war. Well, the question arose as to whether to send more troops. And the deliberations are interesting and instructive. The Joint Chiefs were opposed to sending more troops. And one of their reasons was that they thought those troops would be needed here for civil disorder control. That tells you something. And they spelled it out. They mentioned groups that were going to be a problem. Youth, women, others, literally, and they literally felt that they had to keep the troops here, Also, the government was worried about that time, at the fact that the army was collapsing. The American army, much to its credit, I should say, disintegrated. And that's not a small fact. The United States, again, is unique. Another element of American uniqueness is that other imperial powers have not used citizens' armies for colonial wars. That's unique, and it was a bad mistake. For a colonial war, you need professional killers. You need people like the French Foreign Legion, ex-Nazis. That's what the French used. They didn't send a conscript army to Vietnam. The British didn't use conscript armies. They used professional killers, often hill tribesmen or people who were trained to be professional murderers. You'll notice in South Africa they did the same thing. A lot of the killing is done by professional killers taken from the oppressed communities themselves. It's very typical, incidentally, a typical colonial practice. The United States made a mistake. It sent a citizens' army And you can't get ordinary people off the streets to become professional murderers. And that's what a colonial war is. It means going into a village and killing women and children and old men and that sort of business. So that didn't work, and the army began to collapse, and that was a problem. Well, also another thing, and here again, a decision was made in early 1968, and it's on record, to cut back the war. That's when Johnson decided not to run, and all sorts of things changed. It was just getting too costly. They couldn't win the war at a proper cost. Well, then Nixon came in and tried to continue the war, and a lot of the business community was against him, very strongly against him. They felt it was harming the American position in international trade, it was weakening the dollar, it was causing stagflation, it was causing domestic uproar, which they didn't want. They want a nice, quiet population. And for all these reasons, they really wanted to stop it. There was a real split within the ruling class, if you want. And it's in that context that the New York Times published the Pentagon Papers. It's also in that context that Watergate took place. Watergate, which was in my view largely a farce, was partly a reaction to what strong elements of the ruling class regarded as Nixon's crimes against them. And one of them was just dragging this war on too far when they figured they had achieved what they wanted. Vietnam was not going to recover. Now let's get out and turn to something more important. However, I should say that the release of the Pentagon Papers, I don't know how smart the New York Times editors are, but the fact is that the release of the Pentagon Papers had almost no effect because they've been suppressed. They've been suppressed as effectively as if they had never been released. If you take a look at the books that are coming out, say Carnot, or certainly the retrospectives, but even the scholarly books, and you'll notice that the material in there is not used. See, in fact, the material in there just tells the wrong story. For example, the material on the planning is very extensive in the Pentagon Papers, and that's never used. If people refer to the Pentagon Papers at all, which they rarely do, even in scholarly work, it's usually stuff about the 1964 and 1965, when they were mainly tactical questions. I mean, all the major decisions have already been made. It was only a question of how to implement things. And then you can discuss it. Did we use the right tactics? Should we have done it this way, that way? But the major stuff from the late 40s and through the 50s, that's virtually never discussed. And there's a lot of important material in the Pentagon Papers. I could mention some things, but it's all been suppressed. So it's just as if it didn't get released. Just to give you an indication of this, there's the Beacon Press published the 4 volumes of the Pentagon Papers, and they published the 5th volume, which is an index. And the index includes a collection of essays on the Pentagon Papers by Gabriel Kalko and John Dower, and lots of good essays. I think they're good. I edited the volume. But that volume is practically unsold. A few thousand copies were sold of that volume, and that tells you something. And of course, a lot of the sales are to people who wanted the essays. Now, anybody who's going to use the Pentagon paper needs that volume. You can't use a 4-volume work without an index. Okay? So the fact that nobody was buying the volume, including even university libraries, means that they didn't intend that anybody would ever look at them. Okay? And in fact, that's what's happened.
What's your understanding of your assertion, which seems correct, that people tend to vote against their own interests?
Not against, independent of. Yeah, right. I understand, yeah.
You spoke about if you feel disenfranchised, you just vote for someone that makes you feel good, but why does it make them feel good?
Yeah. Okay, so the question is, why do people vote against their own interests and just in favor of somebody who makes them feel good if they feel disenfranchised? Well, I think that reflects a certain degree of sophistication, actually. If you recognize that the election is a PR game and it's for show, and it's sort of fun, like a circus, so you might as well be part of it, and there's a lot of hoopla, and it's exciting and so on, then who should you vote for? Well, the guy who has a nice smile, let's say, or the guy who makes you feel good when you sort of, watch him on television or something. Why not? I think that's probably the way most people think. That's why you get, see, everyone talks about the Reagan landslide. Well, just take a close look at the Reagan landslide. 53% of the electorate voted, way below any other country. Of that, 59% voted for Reagan, which if you do the arithmetic means he got I forget what, like 32% of the vote. Of that roughly 32% of the vote, about 2/3 I think it was 60% to be precise, said that they hoped that his proposals would not be enacted. Okay? When the detailed polling was done of exits from polls, when they checked people's attitudes, it turned out that I think the figure was about 4% of the people who voted for Reagan said they strongly approved of his programs. What that means is that the landslide consisted of something, maybe 2% of the electorate. Okay? That's the landslide I was talking about. Now, why did people do it? Well, I think the failure to vote, I think we learned something from the fact that the failure to vote was socioeconomically localized, as it always is. People, the people who don't vote didn't see anything in it for them. Of the people who did vote, a lot voted, some voted because, like I have friends. In fact, one friend of mine who was an ex-Maoist, I should say, explained to me that he voted for Reagan because Reagan's been good to him, which is true. People in our income group, Reagan's been very good to. All you have to do is look at the redistribution of real disposable income during the Reagan years, and it's a sort of a straight line. If you break the population up into segments depending on income, low to high, and you ask what's happened to real disposable income, it's going like that. It's fallen for the lowest, risen for the highest, and essentially straight all the way across. So there are people who know that. They can see, the rich can see that stealing from the poor is good for the rich, so they vote for Reagan. But for much of the population, it's just a matter of kind of recognizing the public relations game. You could actually see that. See, the American political commentary is very interesting. So you remember the last election. Take the debates. Okay, what happened in the debates? You remember the commentary on the debates. The commentary was about whether Mondale wore the right tie, or whether Geraldine Ferraro looked down instead of at the camera, or whether Reagan could sort of get by in a half an hour without making some totally idiotic gaffe. That was the level of the commentary. Nobody talked about any issues because they really couldn't find any issues. And in fact, issues are regarded to be irrelevant. The level of cynicism in the national campaigns is really quite remarkable. So, for example, at the Kennedy administration, here's a case in point. During the Kennedy administration, in the 1960 campaign, Kennedy hired a firm run by a couple of MIT political scientists, which is how I know about it, called Simulmatics. One of them was, in fact, a student of the guy, Harold Lasswell, who I mentioned before. And what this company was going to do was the following. Just think of this. The cynicism is mind-blowing. This company, which had a lot of computers and all that kind of business, had broken the population up into lots and lots of categories, like Polish women from 38 to 42 and things like that, all sorts of categories. And they claimed to have a method whereby they could tell for any statement that you made how people in those categories were going to react to it, like whether they would like it this much or that much and so on. And then using, some statistical means and computers and stuff, you could determine the impact across these various voting groups of any particular statement you made. And the point of selling this to the Kennedy campaign was that then they could decide what to say on the basis of how it would sort of average out over these various voting groups that they were trying to appeal to. Well, what that means, that means that a complete understanding that what you say is totally irrelevant to what you're going to do. Well, I think a lot of the population understands that too. And if so, you might just as well vote for whoever makes you feel good, or not vote at all. Incidentally, Europe is well behind us on this, but they're catching up. They'll have packaged elections too pretty soon, by the time they learn the PR tricks and the voter management tricks that we've developed.
You were talking about the level of commentary about the presidential debates. I thought there was one interesting outcome of that. I did hear one of the sort of mainline American network commentors refer to George Bush speaking with Geraldine Ferraro as being shrill.
George Bush is being shrill?
Yes.
I see. Usually went the other way. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, all right. That's the same sort of thing. It's, style is the only thing that counts because they all understand at some level that the substance is elsewhere. And in fact, probably if you sort of look at the last election, it was really a debate over there were policy decisions like should we continue to pour money into military expenditures as a way of revitalizing the economy, or should we worry about the debt and so on? Those are the real issues, but that's not what people debated.
A couple of years ago, you were describing the very volatile situation in the Middle East with Russia manning the SAM-5 missiles in Syria. I believe, if I heard you correctly several years ago, you looked at it as a very dangerous situation for superpower confrontation. You, looking at the situation today, see that the conditions have escalated, possibility of superpower confrontation
In the Middle East?
softened.
Yeah. Could you hear? Well, the comment was that I had said a couple of years ago that, probably around 82, that would have been, I guess, that the Russian manning of SAM missiles in Syria and Lebanon raised the likelihood of superpower confrontation. In fact, one of the consequences of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, Israel used high, sophisticated American technology to destroy a sort of second-level Soviet air defense system as part of the attack against Syria during that war. And the Russians responded, as you'd imagine, by moving in a high-level, sophisticated air defense system and sending, American estimates were about 7,000 Soviet troops to man them. That number's probably reduced a little bit since. And I said at the time that brought the world very close to a superpower confrontation, as indeed it did. Well, since that time, the thing has sort of oscillated up and back. It's been worse in some periods, less in others. During the period when the United States was bombing, when the battleship New Jersey was bombing the hills above Beirut, it was very dangerous. They were probably killing Russians. The Russians didn't respond that time, but it could have blown up. At this particular moment, the tensions happen to have been relaxed a little, and the reason is that the United States has essentially sort of authorized Syria to try to settle the Lebanon problem by itself. However, it's just on the border. I mean, sooner or later, Israel's going to have to attack Syria, and they know it. They're discussing it, and there are very good reasons for it. In the situation of military, the crucial issue in the Middle East is whether there's going to be a political settlement. Now, the United States is the main factor in blocking the political settlement. That's another thing that's never discussed here. The United States has been the major element blocking any political settlement there, and of course Israel too, because it doesn't want a political settlement, but they can do it as long as we back it. And as long as there's no political settlement and there is a military confrontation, Israel cannot allow any Arab state or any combination of Arab states to begin to approach it in military strength. I mean, that's just on perfectly reasonable grounds, because if there is a confrontation, it could lose and it could get wiped out. So therefore, they're going to have to attack Syria pretty soon, and they're talking about it, and they're trying to figure out conditions and so on, and that could very well lead again to a superpower confrontation. That area is the area that's really likely to start the next World War. This, incidentally, is not just my opinion; it's the opinion of virtually every analyst. So, for example, there was a secret Air Force document leaked, in this case, whoever asked about these things, leaked to the press, but as far as I know, not published in the American press. It was published in the Canadian press, called Air Force 2000, which was planning, sort of estimating the likelihood of war up to the year 2000. And they said, like everybody, that the chance of a war breaking out in Europe is very slight. The chance of a war breaking out in the Third World is very high, a superpower war. And they said the Middle East is the main area. The Middle East, what they said is this: as long as the Arab-Israeli conflict is not settled by political settlement, the chances for global peace are remote, and the chance of a nuclear war by the year 2000 are quite high. For people who are involved in the disarmament movement, I should say, this ought to be their primary concern, if they're reasonable. It's a lot more, bad enough to have Star Wars and MX and all that sort of business, but this is much more dangerous. Yeah.
So what then would you say is the American objective for blocking political settlement?
For blocking a political settlement? Well, what's the American objective in blocking a political settlement? Well, this is a complicated business. It goes back to what the whole American geopolitical planning strategic planning has been for the Middle East. And the concept that has been developed over the years is that, as everywhere in the world, we have the same enemy in the Middle East we have everywhere else, namely the indigenous population. what's called over there radical Arab nationalism, where radical is a technical term. Radical nationalism means the nationalism of anybody who doesn't follow orders. It's opposed to what's called moderate nationalism, which is the nationalism of those who do follow orders. Again, this has nothing to do with political position or anything else. By the late 1950s, again on the basis of secret documents released, we know that the United States had recognized that to oppose radical Arab nationalism, it would probably be necessary to support Israel as a military force. That position got strengthened through the 60s, especially with Israel's military victory in '67. And Israel began to be understood as what's now called a strategic asset. In the context of the Nixon Doctrine around 1970, this was further reaffirmed. The Nixon Doctrine, you remember, was a recognition that the United States could not police the world by itself. We didn't have the power anymore, relatively, to do policing action everywhere. We needed surrogate states. And in the Middle East, the surrogate states were supposed to be Israel and Iran under the Shah. And American aid to Israel shot up at that point. By 1979, the Shah had fallen and Israel was left as the last surrogate state. American policy has been to try to turn Israel into a militarized state, highly militarized state, with lacking an independent economy, so that it's completely dependent on the United States for survival. It's important for it to be a pariah state, so therefore it can't get support from anyone else, and kind of a pressure, that we can, like an attack dog, that we can use when we need it to guarantee rather narrowly conceived American interests in the Middle East, and also to use elsewhere. It's very convenient for a superpower that's trying to run the world by force. It's very convenient for it to have a militarily advanced, technologically advanced state dedicated to war with a trained population and nowhere else to look. No other means of survival other than dependence on us. You can use it all over the place. We've used it in Africa, in Asia, but primarily in Latin America. So, for example, the massacres in Guatemala in the early part of the Reagan administration, which were enormous, thousands, if not tens of thousands of people were massacred. The Reagan administration was blocked from conducting them directly by congressional human rights legislation, so it was able to use Israel to do it. And that's valuable for a superpower. Incidentally, the people who support this position are called supporters of Israel. That's another nice Orwellian phrase. They're actually supporters of Israel's destruction, because that's what it's leading to. But that's another story. I think that's the sort of encapsulated the thinking behind it. And of course, that's inconsistent with a political settlement. A political settlement would just mean that Israel would be, something like the Switzerland of the Middle East. But that's no use. We want it to be the Prussia of the Middle East. And that requires a military conflict. So we've blocked any political settlements. A political settlement would mean that Israel would have to withdraw to something like the that's borders. And then it would be, you could have a peaceful settlement in those terms, but not with a really powerful military state there that's in a state of conflict and therefore, it requires military support and is available for military uses. Pardon? Oh, I'm sorry, I can't see very well up there. Yeah, could you? Yeah.
I'd like to know, the Soviet Union is obviously pretty well aware of what's going on in the world. How are they dealing with the grand design of the United States?
Well, for one thing, I'm not sure they're all that aware, but basically they kind of agree with it. The Soviet Union, since during the Second World War, the Soviet Union, we don't have their documents, but we can see pretty well what they were up to. The Soviet Union has been in favor of what is called détente. Détente is a sharing in world management on the part of the two superpowers, where each one, where they are, of course, the junior partner because they're weaker, but where each allows the other to run its own domain without too much interference. So we allow them to run their domain, and they allow us to run our domain, most of it. And that's essentially what they've been pressing since the late 40s, without too much change, incidentally. A little picking away at the periphery, but essentially that's Soviet policy. We occasionally agree to that, like during the years of détente in the early 70s, we for a period agreed to that. But then for various reasons, mainly having to do, I think, with the domestic economy and the need for intervention, we pulled away from it. It's not very pretty, but it's, you know, you can understand it.
You've been talking tonight about how the immorality of our policy and how the different structures support that, press and education. And so through all the study, everything you've been doing, do you think it's possible to reform those policies, change the bad effects it's having, and bring them back and make them more responsive to the people's needs through working through the structures that exist through the press, through the educational and economic systems? Or do you think it's necessary to create new structures, either peacefully or not, or both?
Well, I think it's very hard to give an answer to that. I think we ought to, obviously what you try to do is change the policies as much as you can through existing structures. And it's hard to predict the extent to which they'll be resistant to that, but I think they will be resistant to it. But quite independently of that, I think we ought to change the internal institutions of our own society anyway, because they're oppressive and in many ways intolerable and inhuman. So even if it turns out, contrary to what I believe, that you could make a serious change in foreign policy with our present institutions, we ought to be trying to change them anyhow. Again, well, it depends what you're talking about. For example, one thing that we ought to overcome, I think, I mean, to me it's, I was talking about this afternoon if you were here, but I don't see an enormous difference between a society in which you have to sell yourself to someone and a society in which you rent yourself to someone. I mean, they seem to me approximately equally inhuman. Well, we agree now, though we didn't 100 years ago on the first, that slavery is wrong. But there's another thing which in the old days used to be called wage slavery, which means that you rent yourself to somebody else in order to survive. It means that control over resources and production and investment is in the hands of a particular and rather small group of people, and everyone else has the choice of either dying or renting themselves to them more or less on their terms. That seems to me a totally intolerable form of human life. You know? I mean, there's no reason to accept that any more than there was a reason to accept slavery or feudalism or whatever. Now, you know, how do you change that? Well, you try to change it through existing institutions. You probably fail, in which case you change the institutions, which are not graven in stone. You know, history hasn't come to an end.
What alternative sources of information do you use? I'm very much interested in the alternative press, the little magazine, the radical magazine.
Yeah.
What are those sources that you find most worthy, most honest, most accurate?
Could you hear? What alternative sources are there of information that are, yeah. Well, first let me say that I think when you read anything, including, you know, what I write specifically, you got to remember that everybody's got an axe to grind, you know. And history isn't physics, you know. I mean, in physics, the world pretty much controls what you do and makes you honest. You can't lie in physics; you'll be caught very quickly. But history isn't like that. You know, you can lie for a long time and nobody will ever catch you. The reason is that, you know, the intellectual structure of the field is not such that you got the real constraints of the outside world. So you pick and choose. You know, you pick and choose from a mass of stuff, and you pick what you think is important. And there's a lot of subjective judgment, and there's a lot of ideology, and that should be understood. What that means is that anything that you read, I try to be as upfront as I can be about where I stand. There's also something called objectivity, which is a total fraud, and what that means is accepting the ideology of the established system. That's called objectivity. But you should recognize where somebody's coming from and what they think is important and what their values are and what they're looking for and so on and so forth. And then you got to compensate for it. And there you just have to rely on your own intelligence and understanding. There's no answer. And that's no matter what you read. That having been said, there are 2 points that ought to be made. One point is that the mainstream indoctrination system happens to contain a lot of information. It does for 2 reasons. For one thing, because there are people who have to know the facts, like business. Business has to know the facts. They got a lot at stake. You know? And so when you read the Wall Street Journal news reports, not the commentary, When you read the news reports, they're probably pretty accurate. And the same is often true in the New York Times news reports. Now, you've got to know how to read them, you know. So you have to read defense of South Vietnam as attack against South Vietnam, you know, and things like that. But once you understand how to read them, you know, then you can get a lot of information out of them. And of course, you've got to read carefully. Like, you have to compare today's lies against yesterday's lies. And, you know, or for example, you read government denials. When you read government denials, you're often learning what in fact happened. Quite typically, they will not refer to an event, but they'll refer to the government denial of it, and then you check back, and you know, you find it happened, and so on. So there's all sorts of techniques for you know, penetrating the major media. On top of that, you're of course better off if you read widely. So if you can, say, read, you know, for example, the Manchester Guardian, even the weekly edition, you will learn things about, say, Central America that you won't read in the American press. It's like the British press. It's not because Britain is such a wonderful country. It's just that they don't happen to be the guys who are committing the crimes in Central America, so therefore they can write about them more openly. If you read journals like, say, The Nation, especially people like Alex Coburn, you'll learn an awful lot that'll never be in the American press, or even if it's there, nobody's going to understand it, you know. But he does, and or, you know, in these times, and such journals will have things that either won't have, like, for example, terror in El Salvador has been described in these times and in The Guardian, but not in the mainstream press. That's always been true. At the time of the Tonkin Gulf incident, for instance, when which was a real turning point in the war, total fraud. The government claimed that American ships had been attacked, and that was the start of a big attack in Vietnam. The mainstream press bought it 100%, but The Guardian didn't, and told the truth, in fact. And that turned out to be the truth. I mean, the New York Guardian. Of course, you always read those things with skepticism, like anything. But nevertheless, there are times when they'll report things that the mainstream press won't report, or they'll understand things that the mainstream press won't understand. But ultimately, I don't think there's any substitute for just diligence and intelligence and skepticism, a lot of skepticism. Now, see, that's one of the ways in which people are kept ignorant. You can have all the information there, but only a very small number of people are in a position to put forth the effort to try to figure out what's going on. You have to be very privileged, you know, quite privileged, before you can even do this. You have to have resources, you have to have training, you know, you have to have time, you know, you have to have all sorts of things that most people don't have in order even to be able to figure out what's going on. That's one reason why the country is sort of safe in having a lot of information available. Only very few people are going to be able to get at it. And, you know, that's why you need organization. I mean, if you can group together in organizations, you can do what individuals can't do. That's crucial. That's one reason why the United States has always attempted to block things like political parties or meaningful organizations in which people can participate, because that's the way in which isolated individuals can overcome the lack of resources. The only way. So go to the next CASA meeting.
Based on the theory that it is against our interests.
Sorry, I can't hear.
Based on the theory that it is against the U.S. interest to have a settlement in the Middle East, do you really think those moves now that we are seeing by Egypt, Israel, and Jordan are orchestrated, since they are our guys in a way, or just satisfy the people, or they are?
Well, do I think that the moves by Israel, Jordan, and Egypt are orchestrated? Not really. I think it's sort of a dance, if you like, but I don't think it's orchestrated by the United States. It can't possibly get anywhere. It can't get anywhere because the United States won't tolerate a political settlement, period. So it doesn't matter what anybody does over there, because we play the decisive role. Everybody knows what a political settlement means, and everybody knows that it's been attainable for at least a decade. A political settlement means a two-state settlement on something like the pre-June 67 borders, with recognized borders and territorial guarantees and all that sort of business. That's what a political settlement means. It would probably work. Its support, it may not be very pretty, you know, it may be very ugly, in fact, but it would probably work. It's supported by virtually everybody in the world. It's supported by the Soviet Union, by Europe, by the non-aligned countries, by the major Arab states. It's been supported by the mainstream of the PLO for about a decade. It's only blocked by two categories of rejectionists. One, who we call rejectionists because they're the bad guys, is, say, Libya, for instance. The other, who we don't call rejectionists because it's us, is the United States and Israel. And the United States and Israel have, in fact, led the rejectionist camp. They refuse this settlement. And Israel can do it because we support them in their refusal. And short of that, there is no political settlement. And there is no... It is impossible for any group in Israel to gain any credibility in their own society in favor of a political settlement until they get some support from the United States. The country's just too dependent on the United States. So American opposition to a political settlement, which in fact is crucially centered in the Jewish community and the other so-called pro-Israel communities, that blocks the possibility of any group in Israel arising that could even push for a political settlement there. And so that means there'll be continued conflict, no matter what, no matter what negotiations are going on. But you can, I mean, this again, here's another example of look, something quite dramatic happened about a year ago in this regard. About last April and May, and it tells you something about the press. Last April and May, Yasser Arafat proposed explicitly negotiations with Israel leading to mutual recognition. He proposed that in statements that were widely publicized in France, in England, in Greece, in Asia, all over the place. Israel, of course, immediately rejected it. They don't want mutual recognition. The United States ignored it. Now, what about the press? Well, the press was fascinating in that case. The New York Times and the Washington Post, that is the national press, they didn't even report it. They literally didn't report it. They refused to run op-eds on it. They refused to publish letters about it. One reader in Detroit wrote a letter to the New York Times in which he said, look, you guys are always dumping on Arafat because he won't negotiate. Here he has announced negotiation. He wants negotiations and mutual recognition. Don't you think that ought to be reported? He actually got a letter back from the foreign editor of the Times, which is very rare. You never get a letter back when you write to a journal, particularly from the foreign editor. And I have the letter. In fact, I'm publishing it. The letter is amazing. It says, we are familiar with the statements by Yasser Arafat that you pointed out to our attention. However, they do not represent a significant change in his position, which incidentally is true, although you wouldn't know that from reading the New York Times. And then it goes on to say, if Arafat ever calls for negotiations and mutual recognition, you'll read it on the front page of the New York Times. Well, that's verbatim what he had called for. Okay. Now, you just couldn't have a clearer statement saying that at the top editorial level, they're not going to allow this to be part of history. Okay. All right, that's the New York Times and the Washington Post. The sort of local quality press, like, say, the Boston Globe or the Philadelphia Inquirer or the LA Times, they reported it. But they reported it in such a way that you got to really look hard to find it. It's there, So you could find it if you looked. The San Francisco Herald, or Herald Examiner, I think it's called, which has the reputation of being about the worst paper in the country, had a front page headline, 1.5 inches high, running all over the front page, saying, Arafat to Israel, let's talk, followed by a long UPI story which gave all the details. Well, that's the way it should have been treated in the press. Now, how come? How do you explain this? Well, I think it's very easy to explain. The point is that the San Francisco Herald Examiner is too unsophisticated to understand what news has to be suppressed. So they just make judgments, on the basis of significance. But the New York Times understands very well. See, the New York Times, you have to understand, somebody was talking about reading the press. You see that when you read the New York Times, you have to recognize the tremendous burden, the awesome burden that the editors bear. Namely, they are creating history. History is what appears in the New York Times archives. Nobody's ever going to look at the San Francisco Herald Examiner archives, right? But they are going to look at the New York Times archives. If you're a scholar, what you do is you go to the New York Times archives. So it's extremely important to make sure that the right things are there and not the wrong things, because that's history, and history is important, So, again, like I say, it's kind of an awesome burden. You've got to respect those guys. And you can see, if you read the press carefully, that there's a difference in the way the Times treats crucial issues and the way other less sensitive papers do, because they have to make sure that history reads the right way. So, and this just wasn't allowed in history. Obviously, that can't be allowed in history, so it's out. And you'll never find it in a book, for instance. Oh, okay.
There are still some resource analysts who are saying we're going to run out of oil. Texas has done 15 years, Louisiana, Alberta, Middle East in 35, 40. Isn't that going to speed up the grand plan? Is there evidence of that?
Well, that's all true. We're going to run out of oil. I mean, you can worry about the timing. There have been no big surprises about this, I should say, for about 30 years. By the late 1940s, the oil companies, who are the only people who have the information, apparently knew pretty much where the oil was and how it was going to last and so on. And it's kind of interesting to see what they did about it. One of the things that's very important to realize when you're studying foreign policy planning or even business planning is that it's all done in the short term. People very rarely make long-term decisions. That's incidentally inherent in capitalism. If you're in a competitive capitalist economy and you make long-term decisions before you've ever gotten to the long term, you've been wiped out in the short term. Like if General Motors, let's say, starts putting resources into something that's going to pay off in 10 years, they'll be out of business in 2 years because Ford will be working on a 2-year plan. So the net effect is that planning is almost always very short term. And that carries over to state planning too, which is largely by corporate executives. Well, all right, with that background, and so that has to do with a lot of things. Like take the arms race. I mean, anybody who thinks knows that the arms race is going to blow up and we'll all get killed. But that's in the long term. And we only plan for profitability in the short term. That's inherent in the system, Well, take the oil business. Everybody in the oil business knew in the early 1950s that American reserves were limited. The United States, the Western Hemisphere, the northern part of the Western Hemisphere was in fact the world's major oil producer until 1968. But everybody knew that's going to run out, and that the major oil reserves are in the Middle East. Well, if you were thinking about long-term American security, what you would do is protect American reserves and use Middle Eastern reserves. They did exactly the opposite. What they did is set up the tax system and all sorts of crazy things so that it was more profitable to exhaust domestic American reserves before turning to Middle Eastern reserves. Well, from the point of view of, say, a 10 or 20-year period, that's crazy. Obviously crazy, in terms of security or anything else. But that's what they did, and they did it because, in fact, various considerations of short-term profitability dictated that. Well, sometime they're going to run out of oil, and nobody's thinking about it because that's too far off. We carry out short-term profitability considerations. There's very little conservation going. I mean, there's some. Insofar as the economic system forces it, there's conservation, but not rational planning for conservation. It's just, again, profitability considerations impose, market considerations impose a certain degree of conservation. But real long-term planning about sane use of energy, that doesn't exist. And in fact, if they were even moderately serious about this, we'd recognize that, while conservation may be okay for the industrial countries, it doesn't mean anything for the industrializing countries. I mean, they have to have resources of energy, the kind that we had during the period of industrialization. And we're not going to let them have it. That's one of the reasons why they probably can never get out of the trap of underdevelopment. So these are, I think you're quite right. That's a very serious long-term problem. But until there's rational planning for human use in the industrial countries, it'll just be irrelevant.
Will you happen to know if it's true that somebody found a way to turn water into hydrogen through other than fusion reactions?
I've heard things like that, but I assume they're untrue. I'm not a big expert on it, but I think it's very unlikely that you get outright deception inside the scientific community. Not because scientists are such wonderful people, but because, as I said before, the world doesn't let you get away with it. So one of the fields in which you have to be honest is physics. You can't get away with it otherwise. So I tend to be suspicious about such things. Yeah.
I was just wondering, you seem to have a lot of healthy skepticism and a very cynical attitude, and it's not unfounded, and it goes back in history a long way with a lot of documentation. And I wanted to know what it is that you counteract it with.
What do I counteract it
Yeah.
with? Personally, you mean? Or what do I counteract the Well, things like this. I think what's encouraging is that there are lots and lots of people out there who really want to do something to change things. And, what could be more encouraging than that? Are there enough to bring about change? Well, that's not the kind of thing you speculate about. That's the kind of thing you try to do something about. I don't know. Let's see. Let's try to make there be more people. Look, if you think about it over a longer period, the change is very striking. For example, when the peace movement began in the 60s, somebody mentioned before, it reminded me today that I was very pessimistic then. And in fact, I was. I used to spend my evenings going to talk in the homes of people who would bring together 2 or 3 neighbors, because that's the biggest group you could get, Or we'd set up meetings in churches where we'd bring together like 6 topics, Vietnam, Venezuela, Iran, et cetera, hoping that out of that collection of topics we could get enough people so that the people there would outnumber the organizers. That was going on as late as 1965, I should say, and then blew up. Now the thing is totally different. Now everywhere you go, there's lots and lots of people. The level of sophistication and understanding is way beyond what it was in the 60s, and also I think the level of commitment. Like, look, take the civil disobedience in last week on the Pledge of Resistance. There were in Boston, it's very hard to get information around the country because one of the lessons the press learned in the late 60s was not to report demonstrations, since that has a stimulative effect. If you think you're alone, you may not do things. If you know everybody's doing it everywhere else, you'll do it too. So that stuff is never reported anymore. But in Boston, locally you can see what happens, so it doesn't matter. In Boston, about, I think, probably 600 people or so were arrested in a sit-in in the federal building over the embargo. And I think that that's the largest civil disobedience action ever that I remember in Boston. That was over an embargo, after all. It wasn't over B-52 bombing. Now, that's pretty impressive. It means that there's a tremendous difference between. It was in fact, the thing never got to that point during the 60s. And that means that there's been a big change. So, are there enough people? Well, there are a lot more than there were, and I think there will be a lot more yet to come if people work on it.
Hi. You've talked a lot about the spectrum of opinions that are dictated by the media, and also objectivity and the fact that it doesn't really actually exist. I wanted to talk just for a minute and have you address the issue of emotionalism, which is a double-sided issue. I thought you were going to go into it when you mentioned Vietnam and the retrospectives that are going on right now. You see a lot in the media right now about honoring the Vietnam veterans, and I certainly wouldn't want to give the impression that I was not honoring the Vietnam veterans. I have family members that were killed in Vietnam, but at the same time I wanted to point out that that is something that's going on now, and I've noticed an uprise of it in the last couple of years, that it's okay to be a hero now. In fact, it's really the good thing to do is to go out there and kill people in other countries. And on the other side of that coin of emotionalism is the fact that it's very much frowned upon. Being emotional is very frowned upon. The objective papers, the ones that go into the archives, are the ones that are trusted by people who are moderate people. People who are related to me, family members, have told me that Israel and Israelis are unreasonable and irrational, and that's why they are so militaristic. They've also told me that people who come from Latin America are too emotional, and that's why they have so many problems down there. And I feel like that's something that's supported in our press, too. How do you feel about that?
Well, first of all, I don't think there's obviously nothing wrong with being emotional. You'd be dead if you can't look at things that are happening and not react to them emotionally. But of course, you also have to try to be rational. There's no use giving the weapon of rationality to the enemy. That's too strong a weapon, you know. So yes, obviously. Well, you know, in fact, Hume once said that reason should be the slave of the passions, meaning you start with your emotional commitments, but then you act rationally to try, you know, within those commitments. That's sort of right, I think. As far as the, you know, various societies of the world are concerned, I suppose the United States and maybe sectors of Khomeini's Iran are the craziest societies that exist. You know. So, I mean, for example, it's very hard to find anything anywhere in the world outside of maybe, you know, Khomeinist fanaticism that corresponds to mainstream American intellectual life. I mean that quite seriously. You know, I mean, a place where a president can get up and say that the destruction is mutual, so we owe Vietnam no debt. The educated community that can hear that is kind of off the wall. You know, no point in talking to them anymore. Or a place, or in fact, you know, or a place where the president can get up and say, as he did last week, that Nicaragua poses a military threat so severe that we have to have a national security emergency, and people don't break out in hysterical laughter. That country is somewhere off to the lunatic side of Iran. You know, I don't know of anything like that stuff anywhere else in the world. You know, it's just totally crazy. You know, and so among American educated intellectuals, I mean, the concept of rationality is irrelevant because fanaticism is much too high. You know, jingoist lunacy is much too high, and so on. And all this talk about moderates and, you know, the Latin Americans and so on. You know, I think almost any Latin American peasant understands more about the United States than almost any political science department. Okay, so that's. I'm not joking. I mean that seriously. There was another point that you made, which I forgot.
I was talking about the Vietnam retrospective.
Oh, yeah, the Vietnam veterans. Well, you know, first of all, I don't think that, I mean, should you honor people for doing what they're sort of forced to do? I think you should pity them. I don't see why you should honor them exactly. The people you should honor are people who showed particular courage, like resistors. I mean, they should be honored. You know, but of course they're not going to be for obvious reasons, because people in power don't want resistance. What they want is obedience, so they're going to honor obedience. Now that doesn't mean that you should revile people who did what they were forced to do. You should pity them. You know, you should support them, recognize that they have a tough life, and support them. And that's what happened mostly during the peace movement. This stuff that's going on now about, you know, this sort of a kind of hysterical business about, you know, like what's going on in Santa Barbara, if you read that, where they're having a big revival session where they organize thousands of people and veterans come up and they talk about how terribly they were treated by this or that hippie and so on. Most of that stuff is invented, in my opinion. Or if it wasn't invented, it may have happened. I'm not saying people didn't have the experiences, but it was outside the peace movement. The peace movement was very clear about this. The peace movement was always very, and those of you who were, say, my age and so on will remember this, the peace movement was always very clear about the fact that the soldiers were victims. And nobody was calling them baby killers when they came back, at least nobody who was connected with the peace movement. Now, you know, there may have been all sorts of marginal, peripheral things, but most of this stuff is being concocted and built up and as a kind of a manufactured hysteria for essentially jingoist purposes. Well, you know, I don't think there's much. I don't know, really. I mean, I suspect that, see, I don't think, see, it's very hard to, see, in fact, you take a look at the, I don't believe about the soldiers' guilt. The guilt was not the soldiers. In fact, again, let me say that the, well, see, it's very hard. Look, if you're, it's okay when you're sitting here, you know, to talk about what you should do in the field, but if you're out, you know, trekking through the jungle, and there's an 8-year-old kid there who may kill you, it's hard not to kill him first, you know. Now, that was always understood. And in fact, again, if you take a look at the peace movement literature, you'll see that there was very little discussion of things like, say, My Lai. Like, for example, I wrote an article on My Lai, and I mentioned it in about one line. What I talked about is what's happening in Washington. That's where the criminals are. You know, the guys who are out in the field, there's nothing much they can do. You know, it's very hard under, you know, conditions of combat to make discriminations. Even, yeah, well, maybe. Maybe. I think there's a lot of manufactured hysteria going on. In fact, I was talking to a Swedish reporter a week or two ago who was going around the country. And she went to these Santa Barbara sessions in particular, which are the major ones. She told me it reminded her of the Nuremberg rallies in the 1930s under Hitler, you know. And I think that's going on. There's a lot of manufactured hysteria and, you know, stab in the back business and so on and so forth. And that's no joke, you know. I think one should be very cautious about, you know, I think one should understand this. It's part of the way of building up more jingoist hysteria.
How do you feel about Berkeley? There's always that hope. I was asking people of Berkeley is a hope. When Berkeley went for Reagan,
Well, Berkeley, for example, the question is about Berkeley going for Reagan. Berkeley was always a very conservative town. I taught in Berkeley in '66 and '67, which was the peak of things, and a lot of young people were involved in the movement, but you know, not wealthy professionals. Berkeley is now a yuppie town. You know, it's wealthy professionals. Why shouldn't they vote for Reagan? You know, he's the guy who stuffs their pocket by stealing from the people down in the flats. You know. So, you know, but on the other hand, my daughter's a student at Berkeley, in fact. And nothing's getting reported, but she's been sleeping out on the steps of Sproul Hall lately on the anti-apartheid demonstrations. And she told me the other day that about 7,000 students were involved in a meeting there. It's quite a lot. You know. I've given talks in Berkeley in the last couple of years. There's always a lot of people interested. I mean, you know, Berkeley did change. And I think it's kind of it's not an accidental change. I mean, I think it was partly manipulated change. There's been young people have been subjected to a tremendous propaganda campaign in the 70s, and it's had some effect. I mean, what was considered most frightening in the 60s was the fact that young people acted on honest impulses, and that's scary. So one thing that was done in the 70s was to concoct this narcissism story. You know, one of the big PR jobs in the 1970s was to try to convince everybody that you're narcissistic. You know, you don't care about anybody else. Of course, every individual knew it wasn't true of that person. But, you know, each person knows it's not true of myself, you know. But what you're told is the whole culture is narcissistic, you're only supposed to be interested in yourself, and so on and so forth. Therefore, everyone feels, well, I must be weird, you know, so I better play that game too. And the net effect is, you know, that it does become a cultural pattern, but I don't think it's really deep-seated in any sense. Next time around.
Do you see mass demonstrations or civil disobedience having any effect aside from teaching the government to do things more deviously, more secretly?
Well, after all, that's a big effect. As far as the peace pressure, the administration is much tougher and meaner, and that's not because it's because the objective situation has changed. Central America is a much more. You see, Vietnam was kind of a peripheral interest. The United States could give up trying to conquer Vietnam and nothing much would change in the global scene. Central America is the major area designated for American robbery and has been for a long time. It's not just a matter of robbing their resources. I think the United States is planning to